Socrates by Gerasimos Xenophon Santos. Introduction to Plato's Socrates. Socrates was sentenced to death by a jury of some 500 fellow Athenians and died by taking hemlock in a jail in Athens in 399 BC. He was born in Athens 10 years after the final defeat of the Persians and spent all his 70 years in that city. During his life, he was part of the rise of Athens to her glory. But during the devastation Peloponnesian War, he also saw the rapid decline of Athens. During his years, Greece was the center of the world, and Athens was the center of Greece. He met, mixed, and talked with all manner of men. Great statesmen like Pericles, brilliant dialecticians like Zeno, clever and dazzling sophists like Protagoras, eminent generals like Nicias and Laches, and the greatest sculptors, architects, poets, and playwrights of Greece. He also cross-examined lesser know-it-alls like Euthyphro and Meno, silly jacks of all trades like Dionydosaurus and Ctesippus, corrupt politicians like Critias and dozens of ordinary citizens, clever and dull, honest and dishonest. He tried to teach philosophizing to beautiful and willing youths, like Charmides and Lysis, wild and brilliant Greeks like Alcibiades, devoted friends and pupils like Crito and Phaedo. And he succeeded beyond any teacher's expectation in what has to be the most brilliant pupil of all time, Plato himself. In the midst of the terrible upheavals around him and the variety of his experiences with people, Socrates displayed an awesome presence, maintained a vast philosophic calm, and must have been the only stable thing in Athens in the last half of the 5th century. Day in and day out, he went to the same places, talked to the same people, raised the same questions, discussed them in the same way, and ended up with the same mixture of success and failure. In this way, having the fortune of many brilliant pupils, and at least one great one, Socrates created a revolution in Greek philosophy. This revolution is brilliantly portrayed by Plato in his early dialogues. It is caricatured beyond recognition by Aristophanes, and it is entirely missed by Xenophon. It is perhaps not surprising that men of such different and unequal talent as Xenophon, Aristophanes, and Plato would produce such different portraits. To begin with, Socrates was not easy to understand. He was a man of modest means and equally moderate desires, but he was not a simple man. His habits were strange, his questions unfamiliar, the points of his arguments difficult to grasp, and the most characteristic result be brought about was bafflement. Certainly, he was not easy to see what he was about. Without the benefit of subsequent philosophy, it would take a philosophic genius to understand and appreciate the originality, depth, and sweep of Socrates' philosophizing. Aristophanes was not a philosophic genius, and Xenophon was not a genius at all. Aristophanes did not pretend to understand Socrates, but in his business he could not afford to be baffled either. The Socrates of the clouds is a pretty buffoon, a mighty babbler, a trivializer of trivia, not recognizable as a philosopher at all. If one has read Plato's dialogue, he is entirely unrecognizable. Even on its own terms, the clouds is not a great success. The subject, if it can be treated at all by Aristophanes, calls for intellectual comedy. Aristophanes gives us a silly and not very clever burlesque. The clouds misses the mark, For Socrates without his thoughts is not Socrates at all. Plato's Euthydemus, a comedy of fallacies, is a lot funnier and has to be put down as a greater success. Xenophon's Socrates is strikingly different. Xenophon clearly thought he understood Socrates, but the Socrates he understood is no more than a conventional wise old man mistakenly judged by the jurors to be unconventional. Not a buffoon, but more like a Jesus Christ. Xenophon revered Socrates and introduces him as a little like the evangelists introduce the Lord. He begins chapters in memorabilia with "he said" and "at another time he said." His Socrates is preachy, not philosophic. A comparison between the Platonic Socrates and Xenophon's hero is a study in difference and contrast. There is nothing baffling about Xenophon's Socrates, nothing ironic either. Where the Platonic Socrates seizes the occasion of advice seeking about practical matters to disclaim any expertise and to raise penetrating and original questions about the subject matter, Xenophon's Socrates is ready to give advice on anything without philosophic qualms. Simple and even embarrassingly obvious pointers on how to make friends, how to prosper, how to treat friends and enemies, how to become a good general, really anything at all. Just come to Socrates, O youth, and he will tell you how to fare well. No problem, nor is his talk weary argument, as he says Vlastos, as in Plato. Instead of universal definitions, arresting analogies, suggestive inductions, deadly reductions, and streamlined deductions, we find stories and anecdotes of dubious relevance and simple moralistic messages too obvious to miss. There are, of course, points of similarity, especially in the frequent use of analogies between morals, politics, and the arts and craft. But all the same, Xenophon's Socrates is dull and not much of a philosopher. Certainly not a great one. Xenophon really makes it impossible for us to see either why the Athenians were upset or why Plato was inspired. Plato's portrait makes it possible for us to see both of these things. What upset the Athenians was the central thing that Socrates did day in and day out. The elenchus, the destructive cross-examination of the concepts and principles that the Athenians lived by and Pericles boasted of. It is not only that he refuted prominent and lesser Athenians on the very things they were supposed to know, and famous foreigners on the very things they professed to teach, and that he did it in a humiliating manner, in front of a company, with plenty of irony and sarcasm thrown in. The thing that really hurt was the fact that he attacked the most fundamental principles of Athenian life, the Greek ideals of moderation, courage, justice, piety, wisdom, and versatility. He cut to pieces the intellectual foundation of the body politic and never even tried to sew it back together. Did not Socrates show in the Charmides that Critias and Charmides, who represent two generations of the flower of Athenian aristocracy, did not know what temperance or moderation, the most pervasive of the Greek virtues, was? Did not Charmides and Critias produce 7 different definitions of temperance, all of which Socrates refuted? Did not Socrates confuse them about temperance and bring them to the end of their wits? And is not this intellectual confusion a perfect Socratic explanation of Charmides and Critias' later intemperance? Did not Socrates similarly show in the Laches that the generals of the day, Laches and Nicias, did not know what courage is? Did he not show in the Euthyphro and the Meno that lesser Athenians and foreigners did not know what piety and virtue is? Did he not show in the beginning of the Republic that none of the interlocutors, including Plato's aristocratic siblings, knew what justice is? Did he not show in the Gorgias and Protagoras that the two great sophists, whom the Athenians took into their homes and gladly paid for instructions in the fundamental excellences of life, did not really know what they were talking about? And did he not undermine an essential principle of Athenian democracy when he argued that public officials should not be selected by beans and decisions not made by vote but by the experts on the basis of knowledge of the subject at hand? Nor did the irritating manners that Socrates displayed while conducting these investigations endear him to the Athenians. Here is an accurate and terse summary by Vlastos of the tiresome side of Socrates in the Protagoras. Quote, "He is not a wholly attractive figure in this dialogue in Protagoras. His irony, so impish in the Hippias Major, breathtaking in its effrontery in the Hippias Major, somber, even bitter, yet under perfect control in the Euthyphro, seems clumsy, heavy-handed here. His fulsome compliments to Protagoras, continued after they have lost all semblance of plausibility, become a bore. In his exegesis of the poet, he turns into a practical joker, almost a clown. He is entitled to his opinion that looking to poets for moral instruction is like getting your music from the clever harlots who dance and play the flute for the stupid bourgeois. But why act out this dubious metaphor in a laboured one-man charade, throwing in some philosophic edification on the side, as when he drags in by a misplaced comma his doctrine that no man sins voluntarily?" End of quote. There are many passages in the dialogues where the disturbing effects, the exasperation, the anger, the resentment, and even the fear caused by the substance of Socrates' refutations and the mannerisms of his attacks are brought out by Plato far more efficiently than by any of Socrates' detractors. It is plain that Socrates, besides being an original and powerful mind, was also something of an intellectual clown, a revealer in circus debate, a diabolical needler of his contemporaries. He is constantly on stage, in the agora, gymnasia, and wrestling schools, festivals, dinner parties, the courtyards of great houses. He chooses his antagonists, fixes the subject, makes sure he has the attention of the audience, invites his opponent to speak his mind freely and without fear, elicits from him an opinion, a speech, a dogma, and then proceeds to counterpunch the poor man and his opinion to death, mixing in his blows not only philosophical points and arguments, but also sarcasm, irony, that borders on insincerity and personal insults. And he does not rest until he has extracted from his victim a public confession of utter helplessness. At the end, when it is painfully obvious that his opponent will never recover, he proposes that they all go home and start all over again another time. It is no wonder that he never has a second dialogue with the same man. All this calmly and coolly. No excitement, please. This is not the law courts or the assembly. Matters here are not decided by mobs and votes. The subject calls for reasoned examination by men of knowledge on the basis of their knowledge. How could Socrates not have baffled and upset the Athenians? He was unreal, a unique phenomenon, a Greek upside down, an Athenian with a Dionysian mind, Apollonian emotions and Orphic habits. and his philosophy too, a perfect extension of the man and his life, if ever there was one, turned life upside down, as Callicles helpless complains. All this Plato saw and drew with superb artistry. But he also saw more than this, much more than the Athenians were able to see and appreciate. He saw the immense strength of Socrates' life in the midst of folly, corruption, weakness, and cowardice. He saw Socrates as the star example of the virtues of wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice, the nearest possible approximation on earth of the perfection of Platonic forms. He has, Phaedo says, that Socrates, of all those of his time whom we have known, was the best and wisest and most just. And he says himself that Socrates was the most just of men then living. From a man of Plato's understanding of excellence and wisdom and justice, these simple words are an immense tribute. Plato also saw, understood, and built on Socrates' greatest intellectual achievements. He saw that where all the Greeks praised the virtues of the skies, Socrates raised the simplest and yet more startling question, a question that apparently nobody had thought of before, and certainly nobody understood or pursued in a Socratic way. What is virtue? That is, what is it that is common to all the things that we count as virtue, and by reason of which they are virtue? And similarly, with each of the several virtues, in the same spirit, we have repeated testimony of the startling originality of Socrates' question in the fact that again and again the interlocutors do not understand what Socrates is asking. He has to amplify and illustrate in order to make them understand his sort of question, and he has to set them straight about what sort of answer he is seeking. And we have mountains of testimony to the complexity and fruitfulness and depth of his question, and the philosophical discussions which to this day raise or examine Socratic questions and debate the validity of the presuppositions of such questions. Plato also saw that where the great poets and dramatists took their perceptions of human experience at a face value and proceeded to portray superbly the conflict between reason and passion and the frequent overthrow of reason by passion, Socrates sought to understand this conflict and wondered how such overthrow was possible. Where the dramatists and the poet worked on the level of perception and intuition, Socrates sought an understanding of the concepts that are unreflectively formed by such perceptions and intuitions, and are built imperceptibly into the fabric of language. For the first time in the history of thought, Socrates began to feel his way toward what we have come to call moral psychology. What, from the point of view of motivation and conceptual reconstruction, description and explanation, goes into man's activity, rightly or wrongly, into the understanding of good and evil deeds. Again, Plato saw that, where the Greeks did not think about or took for granted the teaching of virtue, Socrates tried to understand what such teaching could be. Could virtue really be taught? Plato saw that, where the Greeks enjoyed great success in the arts and crafts, Socrates perceived an opportunity in this success to try to conceive of a parallel success in the art of living and ruling. He sought to explore the parallels in the roles of knowledge, motivation, and performance in the two areas of art crafts and conduct. Plato saw that, where the Greeks prized the maxim, nothing in excess, but took it for granted that they understood what it meant, Socrates not only prized it, but also tried to understand what excess and moderation were and what their measure could be. Plato saw that, where the Greeks prized and again took for granted the meaning of another maxim, a sound mind in a sound body, Socrates sought to examine the meaning of this maxim and tried to construct a strict parallel in which virtue in the soul corresponds to health in the body, and the arts that tend the soul correspond to the arts that tend the body. A parallel with revolutionary implications for our conceptions of wrongdoing and punishment. In every Socratic enterprise, Plato saw Socrates beginning with the ordinary conception of Greek life, but digging deep to unearth underlying assumptions, to overthrow some, to try to understand the implications of others, to build theoretical foundations for yet others. In the Socratic enterprise, Plato saw a new world, supremely worth exploring, the world of philosophy. In Socrates himself, Plato saw a man with an endless passion for reason, a man who had achieved a complete harmony between reason and passion, and between word and deed, a fantastic integration of life and thought. Only by stretching our imagination to catch this integration can we make believable to ourselves the Socrates of the Apology, the Crito and the Phaedo, the Socrates who inspired Plato. To my mind, it is Russell, a man of a very different type, who comes nearest to capturing this Socrates in a simple sentence. Quote, "The Apology gives a clear picture of a man of a certain type, a man very sure of himself, high-minded, indifferent to worldly success, believing that he is guided by the divine voice and persuaded that clear thinking is the most important requisite for right living." End of quote. Few subsequent philosophers have achieved this integration between philosophic thought and philosophic life. One thinks of Spinoza. Perhaps even fewer philosophers have considered such integration necessary. And we certainly have many instances of great philosophic achievements, whether systematic or analytic, that have not been accompanied by equally great lives. Great as these achievements are, they are not always as convincing, and they are never as inspiring. It is certainly a stroke of good fortune that the first great philosopher could inspire and teach as well as he could philosophize. Thank you.